My name is Emma Truitt. I am one of the permit writers for municipal stormwater permits at Department of Ecology. And I will be moderating this session titled Stormwater Management Action Planning with our speaker, Abbey Stockwell. I think we all kind of know the drill by now, but feel free to enter any of your questions into the chat throughout this session, and then we will get to them at the end. All right, with that being said, go ahead and take it away, Abbey.
All right, thanks, Emma. I'm Abbey Stockwell. I am the Phase II Municipal Stormwater Permit Writer for the state. And I wish I could see you all. I've been really impressed with the presentations I've seen so far at Municon. So I hope I level up to what I've experienced so far. So I'm going to get into the Stormwater Management Action Planning requirements in the Phase II permits. And I'm going to focus on the Western Washington Phase II permit requirements here. The Phase I permit does have a requirement for stormwater planning. Phase Is were required to develop plans last permit cycle. And so their requirement is to refine their plan to a specific catchment and submit that. So going forward, I'm just going to focus in on the Phase II requirements, since this is a new requirement for Phase IIs. And I'm going to get into what the permit requirements say, sort of in the context of the SMAP guidance that we published with the 2019 permits. And this is guidance. It's meant to assist you with your process of developing an SMAP. And we know that there are already jurisdictions out there that have already started planning or already doing this work before it was even included in the permit. And that is really great. And we don't want you to recreate that work or have to do it again. So if you already have plans that meet the permit requirements, feel free to use those, or maybe you can leverage those plans and add a couple more pieces to it in order to meet the permit requirements. So we put this in the permit because we know we have legacy development that's not being addressed by the new and redevelopment permit requirements. And even applying low impact development as our preferred and commonly used approach is not going to be enough to fully achieve the designated uses in our developed and developing areas. And on top of that, we know that funding for stormwater strategies and capital projects is limited. And local jurisdictions need to be really smart and need to prioritize their spending, and will likely want to direct that extra effort and spending to areas where basins or catchments will most readily achieve improvements in the receiving water, and the benefits can be widely appreciated. And so the SMAP is getting at these two main questions. How can we most strategically address existing stormwater problems? And how can we meet our future population and density targets while also accomplishing our water quality goals? So the SMAP is made up of three main components: a receiving water assessment, a receiving water prioritization process, and then the action plan. So in a nutshell, permittees are going to develop a long-term MS4 plan for a catchment area or several catchment areas for which they're going to identify within a priority basin. And the focus of the SMAP is primarily on identifying actions that are most likely to improve the hydrologic and water quality conditions of the receiving water. So these plans need to consider an appropriate combination of capital projects, maybe regional facilities, maybe land acquisition, land use or zoning code adjustments, in addition to other enhanced actions you could take from your stormwater management action plan, such as enhanced maintenance or maybe even education and outreach campaigns that might be appropriate. And although, just sort of like as an aside, although I'll be talking about this SMAP development process as a series of steps, I get that this is not a linear process and that these steps could be taken simultaneously, or you may need to circle back or jump ahead. or what have you, and that's okay. It's just sort of logically easier to write these things out as steps. But it's a living process, right? And so one of the first things you should do in the development of your SMAP is convene that interdisciplinary team that's part of your stormwater planning program. This team can be used to coordinate this whole planning effort across your various departments, help compile the existing information that you have. They can help refine your prioritization results, help prepare the plan, and then evaluate the process and the implementation of that plan once that happens as an ongoing task. And I want to emphasize the step of using your team because coordination is key. It's key with your departments so that you can uncover all of the opportunities, all of the needs, all of the complexities of a project. But sort of getting beyond the team, coordination will also be important with your neighbors in the watershed too. So I want to call that out. Okay, so now that you have your team briefed and ready to go, what due dates do you need to meet? And I want to stop here and recognize that this may be a little bit different than how the permits have been structured in the past. But the way we did this in the 2019 permits is we tried to align submittal due dates with the annual report due date of March 31st to cut down on the different number of dates we use in the permit just from a tracking and a simplification standpoint. And I can see how it gets a little bit tricky too because we use dates in the permit to set interim milestones to ensure that a requirement is going to be met at the end of the day. So in the SMAP section, there are 3 main dates you need to track. The first is submitting the watershed inventory, which will be due March of next year. And this will be the summary of the information you've collected during this receiving water assessment process. Next is to document the prioritize and ranked list of receiving waters and prioritize at least one catchment for the focus of your SMAP, and that's due in June of 2022. Nothing needs to be submitted to Ecology on that date. That's just one of those interim dates by which you need to have something, you know, that step in the process done by. You'll submit that documentation with your SMAP the following year in March of 2023. So the first step in the SMAP development process is this receiving water assessment. Colin Hume, who's in the next talk, is going to go through this section in pretty good detail when he talks next. So this receiving water assessment section of the guidance breaks down this assessment into 4 parts listed on the slide here. And it's trying to get at that every part of your jurisdiction drains to receiving water of some type and size, whether it's actually in your jurisdictional boundaries or not. And to clarify some of the terms I'm using, when I talk about basins, I am talking about a scale of 1 to 20 square miles of total drainage area, and that includes the contributing areas outside of your jurisdiction. And when I refer to catchments, these are the smaller subbasins that's more like the 400 to 600 scale, acre scale, excuse me. You're going to want to use a scale that works best to meet your goal or goals. But that's in the general guidance we provide. So ultimately, at the end of this whole assessment, this step should result in a map of your jurisdiction delineated into basins and a list of receiving waters to which your MS4 is discharging. Again, whether those are in your boundaries or not. So after your basins are delineated, you'll next compile and review the available information to understand the likely condition of each of your receiving waters that you're discharging to. This step This assessment of your receiving water conditions is intended to be a rapid assessment of what you know about their conditions. And this information is going to help you for the next couple of steps that are coming up. You're not expected to collect any new data or establish a local monitoring program. Our guidance often refers to Department of Commerce's Building Cities in the Rain guidance, which provides a lot of information, especially sources of information for where you can gather receiving water condition information that you can use in this step. You'll want to document how you're using your data sources and maybe identify what data or information would be useful to improve it. So some of the information you'll want to collect at this stage is the designated uses in your receiving water, the desired conditions in the receiving water, land use, where growth is planned, or maybe transportation plans or needs, and information about overburdened communities in your contributing areas. So where there might be overlap in improving receiving waters and human health, those communities and areas you want to identify. And I have this in my notes, but I've said it a little bit, but I want to be clear that you should be documenting each of your steps so that you can show your work if you're asked, even if something's not totally due at that time. The third step in the receiving water assessment is assessing the stormwater influence, the stormwater management influence. And this step will provide the rationale for sorting your receiving waters according to their relative expected benefit from the SMAP. So this assessment requires you to use your judgment as to the relative influence your MS4 and your potential SMAP actions will take to protect or improve receiving water conditions. And so this use of your judgment is going to be based on the information you've uncovered or collected in the first couple of steps. A basin that has relatively low expected stormwater management influence for an SMAP is defined as having both low expected hydrologic impacts and low expected pollutant loadings. And we define that in the guidance. For example, low expected hydrologic impacts is that your MS4 is draining directly to a flow control exempt waters. And for example, a low expected polluting loading from an MS4 is runoff coming from low density residential land uses, for example. There's some other things listed, but I'm not going to read them all off right now. If there's questions, we can cover that at the end. There's also several questions that you'll want to document the answers for around stormwater management influence, and it's mainly getting at whether your stormwater BMPs will be effective at addressing the sources of pollutants or causes of disruption in the watershed. Basins that do have low expected stormwater management influence are not required to be included in the rest of the SMAP steps. You're just going to provide your completed watershed inventory with your annual report and include your assessment of the stormwater management influence. Okay, so moving on to the last step of the receiving water assessment is assessing the relative conditions and contributions. So again, in this step, you're going to narrow the number of receiving waters and basins to a candidate list to include in your prioritization process. You will evaluate the planned and expected future land uses in each potential candidate basin and consider how the changes are likely to impact water quality or habitat and biota in the receiving waters. Part of this step might include reaching out to your neighbors and seeing what they might be thinking about projects within the same watershed so that you can leverage that work with your own. Our guidance talks about how you can, at this step, start to delineate your catchments. but you can also wait until the prioritization step as well. So here you're going to want to, again, document the approach and your reasoning for the decisions you make so that you can clearly explain yourself in this next step, the prioritization process, where the guidance talks about bringing in the public and other stakeholders. The final product of the receiving water assessment will be this watershed inventory that organizes all of your information into a common format. And it will include the relative findings from each step. So again, you want to document your overall rationale for this list of basins and what you might be proposing for restoration goals or protection goals for each receiving water. And like I said, this watershed inventory will be submitted with the annual report. Okay, so the next step is the receiving water prioritization step, and you'll establish and conduct a process to prioritize your candidate basins to select an area of focus for the SMAP. And 3 strategic SMAP elements will be highlighted during your prioritization process. So looking at strategic retrofits, including a combination of both improvements of existing structural stormwater facilities and siting and constructing new ones, new facilities. Looking at land management strategies that can act as a water quality management tool to conserve, protect, or restore your receiving waters. And then strategic stormwater management plan enhancements and targeted stormwater management actions that you might be able to take within a catchment that will be productive and useful. And you'll want to, at this step, you'll want to include your appropriate stakeholders. So we do call out public and tribal engagement in the SMAP process and development. And this is key to ensuring that all the information that you have available to you is complete and weighed by the stakeholders. And this should help establish buy-in for the actions that will be proposed. Okay, so ultimately, all of these steps should lead up to development of your Stormwater Management Action Plan, your SMAP. And this is due March 31st, 2023 with the annual report. And it needs to cover at least one high priority catchment area in a high priority basin. And it needs to identify a description of the stormwater facility retrofits needed in the area, including the BMP types and the preferred location, land management or development strategies identified for water quality management, and then the targeted, enhanced, or customized implementation of the stormwater management actions. And we call out IDDE field screening, prioritization of source control inspections, O&M inspections, or public education outreach behavior change programs. The SMAP should also include, oops, I went too far. The SMAP should also include a proposed implementation schedule and budget sources, and outline the actions organized into short-term goals and actions and long-term goals and actions, as well as a plan to adaptively manage this plan. So how can you, when it would be a good time to revisit this plan after it's been implemented, or to reconsider new information and to improve the plan. Okay, so finally, some concluding thoughts are a solid receiving water assessment will highlight which areas can be improved with municipal stormwater BMPs and actions. A good prioritization process will include your stakeholders and be transparent and ensure that the goals of the priority receiving water and the SMAP are clear. And a successful SMAP will strategically identify approaches in addition to the current requirements of the permit that will be used to accommodate future growth and development while preventing water quality degradation and improving receiving water conditions caused by receiving water conditions that were harmed caused by past development. And like I said, the SMAP will hopefully have broad public support as a result of your process. And that will allow the permittees who have successfully completed all these steps to have confidence that your SMAP will, when implemented, will have a substantial and positive difference in your receiving water conditions. And then we do talk about coordination, as I've said, and it may be helpful to reduce the effort needed for your SMAP deliverables by coordinating with neighboring jurisdictions to leverage the different work that you all can do in order to achieve some receiving water benefits. And I believe that is my last slide. So it's time for questions.
Awesome, thank you. We do have a few. The first one, do we expect to see these requirements in the next permit cycle for Eastern Washington?
So that is a good question. We have not made any decisions about what's going into the next permit cycles for any of the permits. But it has been raised whether Eastern Washington should have planning requirements. So I think that's something that could be on the table for next permit cycle.
Good.
No decisions have been made. We'll talk with our permittees and our stakeholders to get your thoughts on how that could be useful. Not just for anyone.
Right. Have you developed a boilerplate or idealized case study to help guide folks?
We have not developed that. But there are some jurisdictions that are ahead of this permit requirement. And so those jurisdictions may be useful to talk to in developing your own plans. And I think some of them did present at Municon, so those would be the ones I would reach out to.
For determining basins with low stormwater influence, should the basin meet both categories or just one?
Yes, it needs to meet both categories of low hydrologic impact and low pollutant loadings. It needs to meet both.
I have one. So how could jurisdictions use this as an opportunity to coordinate or collaborate on a more regional scale?
Yeah, so when we were going through the public comment, we did hear a lot of comments for a desire to work on a regional scale, and that is completely allowed within the permit requirements. It may be useful as far as collecting information or sharing information for your receiving water assessment. It may be helpful to talk to your neighbors about establishing a similar or same prioritization process and ranking process, so that your region is sort of thinking about the receiving waters on the same way. And but when it comes down to the actual SMAP, your SMAP needs to be within your permit coverage area. So you couldn't have, or if you did develop a regional SMAP, it would need to have projects within each partnering permittee jurisdiction, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. There's no more questions in the chat, but I'll just give it one more minute just in case somebody's typing something out right now. Otherwise, you have any final thoughts or words of wisdom, Abby? Here we got one. How does SMAP overlap with SFAP funding? To make sure.
Oh, you will have to watch Jessica's talk. She will be after Colin's talk in our workshop, and we'll go over all of the grant funding eligibility and how to write a good grant for an SMAP. But I believe that there is some overlap in that you can get grant funding to help with your SMAP development.
We got another one. Are EJ criteria included as requirements in the SMAP's prioritization process?
So we do, in the prioritization process, we do ask that permittees identify overburdened communities, and if they're within your contributing areas to your receiving waters. And so if there were two basins of relatively the same when you compare them as far as receiving water conditions, if one basin does have an overburdened community, that may be the basin that you want to, and the other doesn't, that may be the basin that you want to prioritize. The guidance does talk about how to think about that. So we call out, addressing overburdened communities where you can find the overlap in human health and receiving water conditions, trying to improve both at the same time is, I guess, the goal there.
Good. Well, I think that is all of the questions. So I think, oh, nope. Just when you think you're done, one more trickles in. Will projects identified through the SMAP process be eligible for grant funding? In the past, permit required actions have not been eligible for grant funds. Or is this covered by Jessica?
Yeah, I think Jessica will talk about that too, but in general, we're not, and Jessica can fix this if I mess it up, but in general, we're not requiring those specific projects that you've identified as a permit requirement. So I think that's how they may be eligible. And I think, the grants program is interested in funding good projects. So projects that have good planning behind them makes a project much more desirable to fund, I think. So
Jessica wrote in the chat that she is covering that in detail at 11:05. So
yes, stay tuned.
Yeah, so stay tuned. We do have one more question in the last couple of minutes here. If a basin is low in hydrological influence and pollutant loading, then you don't go on to assess relative conditions and contributions. So I guess it's like a confirming statement, like yes, no.
That's right.
All right, well, thank you, Abby, and everyone for the conversation and the information. And it sounds like there's a lot of interest in Jessica's talk coming up, so stay tuned. Otherwise, we'll just get out a few minutes early here.
Thanks, everyone. I appreciate it.
All right, thank you.